Hello everyone, this is a video response to Shrinking Violet and her video, Beware of People Who Say C-PTSD Made Me Do It. Link in the description box to her video. Give her a chance and subscribe her. She's a pretty good YouTuber. I've been watching her of late, and in her video she makes the point that people who are saying that they have C-PTSD are not acting in accordance with what you would expect as far as symptoms and reactions that you would expect from somebody having that sort of diagnosis. And it seems like there's a certain subsect of people that like to talk about trauma and use it as though it is something that is universally recognized as something that you can't question at all. If somebody says, I have trauma, then, leave them alone. Leave them alone. And I've been talking about trauma lately on my channel, and this video resonated with me because of that. And I'd like to say that, yes, there seems to be a special little world out there on the internet where, for starters, rape is the worst thing that ever happens. Absolutely. Like, if you had a scale of, like, good to bad, rape would be the absolute worst thing. And the best way for you to come across as being smarter than someone else or better than someone else would be to, in an argument, say, well, whatever you're proposing here would equal more women are going to be raped. And it doesn't matter how convoluted your reasoning is. If you say that your opponent is a proponent of rape, you win. That's like the trump card. There's no way of arguing because you have thrown out that they are the rapists. So, yeah, it does seem like in that subsect of people, PTSD gets thrown out there as something that a lot of them happen to have because they identify with victims of domestic violence or other sorts of things that can, give you trauma as you grow older. And it seems to me that they defend themselves by saying, well, you're triggering me. Triggering. And the language of PTSD, it seems to fit their narrative of there's parts of my being that you cannot question. There's parts of my belief system that you cannot question because I have been traumatized. Shut up. Recognize that I have trauma and you can't go there. And it does seem like it gets used as a shield by people that are not acting like people would be expected to act if they had PTSD. That being said, there are some instances that I can think of where somebody who had PTSD would lash out at someone. First of which would be if they were cornered by their stressors. Just like any wild animal, backed into a corner, it'll retreat, and then when there's no way out other than to lash out, people with PTSD may lash out. Also, there's case studies on this. It's called dopaminergic depletion, whereby somebody who has PTSD is subjected to some stressors that trigger them for a very long period of time, like a couple days of having to deal with something. And under those circumstances of dopaminergic depletion, their brain chemistry just gets depleted from dealing with those stressors. Yes, they can get angry and lash out. But I'd say by and large, what Shrinking Violet's saying is generally true. There are people who seem to be using PTSD as an excuse to say, well, my PTSD made me do it, and you can't question that. I have the right to say these things because PTSD is on my side. Um, and when it becomes political and it's used as a political shield, um, I'm drawn to remembering that the biggest researcher in the field of PTSD, um, in my mind, would be Dr. Judith Harman. And if you were to look at any interview of Dr. Judith Harman, you would realize that, yeah, she was a political activist herself. And so, the way that the word trigger gets used outside of the context of trauma, and it's now being used in the political sphere. Those triggers that anything that annoys you is now a trigger. It doesn't have to actually have hurt you psychically. It all it needs to do is annoy you, and it's triggering you now, right? The way that word became part of the lexicon of those people was the originator of research into PTSD. Dr. Judith Harman was a political activist, and she was active in many spheres. And yeah, you just have to look at her work to see how these words are now being used in other spheres. What's interesting, though, is Shrinking Violet automatically adds the C to the beginning of PTSD. That's actually a political thing. Let me explain. Complex PTSD is a way of delineating what you mean by PTSD. There's PTSD and then complex PTSD, where you were under conditions of like being trapped, like you were a prisoner of war, you were in jail for a very long time in solitary confinement, you were in an abusive relationship for a very long time. That would be complex PTSD. Those traumas happened over a long period of time. And then there's now regular PTSD, right? I'm assuming we all know what that is. If you don't, well, this regular PTSD without the C, without the complex modifier, would be, something else that caused your post traumatic stress disorder that was not over a very long period of time. It was over like a very short span. Maybe you got raped twice in college. Maybe you had to clean up a bunch of dead bodies at the bottom of the World Trade Center. Something like that happened over just a couple weeks, not like a very long span of time. So, what's interesting about the complex modifier, C-PTSD, is most most psychotherapists and the DSM that we use, basically the psychologist's Bible that we use, don't recognize the C modifier. We don't use the word complex to delineate what was a long-term trauma that you suffered from, or short-term. But the one person who does use that complex modifier and then taught the Veterans Affairs in the United States to use that complex modifier is Dr. Judith Harman, who basically is the biggest researcher in the field. So her being pretty much an activist in all of the different realms of her life, plus being that particular researcher, she wanted to extend the trauma definition to all of these things that gets down to just those things that annoy you from the day-to-day oppression of women in America. You know, the that kind of watered down, spreading thin of the word trauma. That's okay with her because, you know, she's very active in those circles where PTSD is often used as a shield, basically. And so for me to call her out on this is actually like a heresy that like most psychotherapists are doing, and the DSM does do, because it doesn't list complex PTSD anywhere, you know. But it's like those people who do say complex PTSD, they can reference, well, Dr. Judith Harman said so. So there is a difference between this PTSD and this other PTSD. And to me, really, when I look at the history of PTSD, you know, all the way back from when it was misunderstood as shell shock, all the way till today, where there's, you know, some people using the complex modifier. What it reminds me of is the argument for gay marriage and all of the different ways that people want to say it. So, in some states in America, instead of having marriage be the word that they want to use for homosexual spousal vows, they'll say, well, we're going to give them civil unions, and it's going to be the same, it's just not going to be called marriage, right? And there's people who will argue, well, marriage is, you know, it's a religious thing, it's got tradition to it, and then there'll be like people that say, bullshit, you know, marriage, you know, predated your religion, and it has nothing to do with your religion, because there's people that aren't in your religion that are heterosexual, they get married, you know, by judges and shit. And, you know, how well do the people in your religion actually treat this marriage as you're calling sacred? All this bullshit. So, like, they'll make the argument that actually gay people should have marriage instead of civil unions. Let's not have a separate but equal thing. We'll have the gay people be married. Well, then those traditionalists who are bigoted will say, maybe we should add the modifier to our marriages by saying that we were married in holy matrimony, right? And that's sort of an argument to set them apart from the broader definition of marriage, as it is becoming accepting of all sorts of people, you know, homosexuals included, you know, setting themselves apart as being this other kind of marriage. That to me is just like using the modifier complex on PTSD. Okay, it's saying, okay, this is the type of PTSD that we used to consider real PTSD, that excluded all of that bullshit, watered down, stretching thin of the word trauma, right? So we're going to call it complex PTSD so that we don't have to talk about those watered down versions anymore, because they've been taking the word PTSD and applying it to so much crap that really doesn't do us any service if we're talking about these long-term traumas that were suffered, right? So what that allows then is for PTSD and trauma to be used on a wide variety of things. It's more inclusive, right? When you make that modifier for what we would talk about clinically as being PTSD, and always add that C to the clinically really bad cases. It's just like the way that marriage has now been, you know, extended to everyone, and I'm in favor of that, but where it gets weird is how trauma can be now anything that annoys you. You know, people smacking their mouth when they eat, you know, can now be something that triggers you. When it used to be something that would really, really scare you, or situations that would remind you of your trauma. Now, somebody having a different opinion than you and being in your presence could be a trigger. Oh my goodness, you know? And then what happens when those people are triggered? Triggered. Do they act like a person who has PTSD? No. No, they don't. They start to gather their friends and want to, you know, attack the person who has that differing opinion, and they act in ways that does not look like what they're now calling complex PTSD. They have PTSD, regular, right? The kind that everyone can have. So yeah, link in the description box to Shrinking Violet's video, and thanks for listening. I went off on a rant today, I guess. See you next time.